if you get bogged down in infighting, then you've got a major problem, because that's all that happens then, you know, and then you're going to end up with major divisions that almost debilitate the movement, which obviously is no good. So Ronnie, you've got an X. Can we unmute Ronnie?
Yep, just have, so you should be able to speak.
Yeah, I think that's like a kind of, I mean, Roger probably agree with me, it's like a kind of sort of sociological reason why there's been this change in the vegan movement, where a lot of people are apolitical. A lot of people are kind of identifying themselves as right wing, for instance, now, or I would not the majority, but perhaps a substantial minority. In the early days, you know, when the kind of animal rights movement started kind of getting going in this country in the 1970s into the 80s, it was really difficult to live as a vegan. It was almost impossible to eat out. It was not easy to get vegan products, and so people that became vegan tended to be already radical people that kind of weren't worried about being kind of part of society, weren't worried about being kind of normal people, so to speak. So a lot of other ideas kind of went with veganism. For instance, anarchism. Like lots of vegans were anarchists in those days. You know, it tended to be like a very, very left-wing movement in its thinking because of that. Because people, were unconventional, didn't want to be conventional. But I think now, because it's kind of it's so easy now to live as a vegan, that people that aren't so radical in other ways, don't set themselves apart from society in other ways, kind of have become vegan, at least in terms of consuming a vegan diet. And I think that may be one of the reasons why we've seen this kind of change in politics in the movement. The other thing is also it's also a lot easier now. In the old days, I'd say, it was a lot more vegans were activists percentage-wise as well. And I think the reason for that was because it was actually easier in those days to be an activist than to be a vegan. To live as a vegan was kind of so difficult. It was actually easier to be an activist. It was easier to go on a demo. It was easier to go on a hunt sap than to kind of be a vegan. But now it's the other way around. It's kind of so easy to live as a vegan that it's easier to do that than to be an activist. And I think that's why we've had this kind of change round in both of those areas.
Yeah, well, I'd say there's a lot in that, Ronnie, and the issue of mainstreamness comes into this thing, you know, because like I say, you know, movement take off, a lot of people coming in, and then we tend to think, well, you know, if veganism enters the mainstream, then we're on the road to winning, you know. But that does have a lot of kind of dangers to those kind of more radicalized people. It's reflected in other areas. Academics tend to bemoan the fact that their students tend to be apolitical and not so politically knowledgeable and active nowadays and that kind of stuff. So it does happen kind of elsewhere, I suppose. And then you've got to address the fact that, well, isn't this just what's going to have to happen? Because if we want a vegan world, then in some senses, veganism has to become mainstream. I think an interesting point there, which for people to contemplate, is a video that Patrice Jones puts out, and it's called Commonalities of Oppression. And you can find that on YouTube, and it's about 20 minutes. And she's pointing out there that the mainstream isn't the majority of people in the world. That if you add up all the marginalized people of the world, who are kind of almost by definition a bit more radicalized, if you add those up, then you've got more people. And so if you want a big movement, it would actually probably make more sense to appeal to the more radicalized, marginalized groups and try to see if we can bring them together in some kind of alliances. Whereas I think in terms of national groups, in terms of celebrities, in terms of the entrepreneurs in the movement and everything. I think the idea of becoming mainstream is very seductive for them, because it gets them on the TV and it gets them into kind of places that seem to be kind of important. Whereas if you're working on the more radical margins, it's more DIY politics, as I mentioned before, and it's not so kind of grandstanding. It's more kind of communal, I suppose. So there might be a difference there, which would be worth kind of exploring. It's hard to say, really.
Did have a question from Dean, not one that could be answered in 6 minutes, mind, but perhaps we can.
Is there such a thing as a question that can be answered?
Not on the Animal Rights Show, there isn't. That's for sure.
No.
I'll read it out. So Dean has said, and I'm assuming he's referring to pro and anti-intersectional here. How can we move on, though? Should these groups just call a truce?
What does it mean is the question, isn't it? I mean, because I mean that's similar to the idea. I'm not accusing Dean of anything here, but that's similar to the idea. Well, I want people to be marching along, men's rights activists and Trump supporters and all that. And now that's a call for unity that's just not going to happen. In the sense that it's the more threatened people of those groups that are not going to turn up. Because it wouldn't be a safe space for them. So to call for unity in the name of being apolitical is actually a political thing to say, because it's not apolitical. It's just what you call it. So you can't really get away with the idea that everybody can come into the movement. I mean, I was told recently, well, if we don't appeal to the right wing, then we'll never be able to give a message to 50% of the population. Which is not true, but also kind of missing the point, because if we make alliances with groups that oppress others, then we've got a problem. We ought to be on the side of those who are oppressed, including the other animals, and go from there. So in terms of making alliances, growing the movement, it's always been thought that the most obvious thing for a radical movement to do is you make contact with other radicals or progressives. These kind of terms are difficult, obviously, but that's kind of what you do. Whereas the idea of making yourself appealing to people who would be on the other side, as it were, might be much more difficult.
I think it was more about just in regards to how do we move on, because these groups are never going to get on. So is it a case, do we kind of ignore each other and just, I think what I find at the moment is there's been a lot of energy is being focused on the pro and the to and fro between the two groups, that it is losing some, our focus on the animals. So if they're not going to agree, how do we find any kind of common ground when obviously there's such a division? I think that's the difficulty I'm finding at the moment. It looks like they're at loggerheads. So how do we move on? Because we're just wasting all this energy, this negative energy back and forth.
Yeah, but that goes back to what's been said already, Dean, that the fact that people tend to move on by splitting.
Yeah,
that's the way we deal with it, in the sense that if there's a chasm, as it were, that can't be bridged, then you've got no choice but you just say, okay, well, you stay on your side and I'll stay on mine, don't think.
Okay.
So Ronnie, you might be finishing us up, I think, because we've got about a couple of minutes left. So can you say a sentence in 2 minutes, Ronnie?
I think we may be in a situation where we kind of have to cut our losses, and we kind of do that in vegan outreach anyway, don't we? Like sometimes someone will come up to the stall or whatever, and you realise that you're never going to get that person to agree with you, or to sort of, they don't seem to be moving anywhere in your direction, and so it's better to kind of just let them go on their way, and in that conversation, and to move on to other people that you have more chance of changing. I think it's kind of like that, you know, with some of these kind of right-wing vegans, for instance. That, I mean, I think that just from the point of view of the animals, it's not consistent to be a right-wing vegan. I don't know, I won't go into that now. I've already kind of caused loads of controversy with that. But I think we have to be the same with them. You know, there's a time when we have to say, right, okay, like we're not getting anywhere with them. We have to move on, and we have to concentrate on doing positive things. We have to concentrate on building a grassroots activist movement, and you know, and kind of put our focus more on that. To be honest.
Oh, cheers, thanks. Yeah. So on all this, you know, how do we align ourselves or unity? That sort of like conversation. I think it's really interesting because one of the vegans that I know is very much basically a libertarian and doesn't buy into sort of, you know, like, you know, sexism or anti-racism or anything like that. Although this person has been like super sort of like supportive in other ways. So I've had long conversations with them. And I sort of like with this person, because I can have a long conversation, there's a sort of like, you feel like you could work with them on certain sort of things, and they've actually been bizarrely supportive in certain ways, where other vegans have not been. So I think and I've seen this in other campaigns as well, other not vegan stuff, and other social sort of like movements, this discussion of, you know, like with, say, the left, how can we, you know, sometimes there seems to be a sort of, a kind of common ground between, say, radical left and sort of some elements of maybe the more right wing or even libertarian. There seems to be this sort of like weird kind of like crossover thing that happens on certain sort of like issues. And I couldn't understand this at all. And then I saw, I think it was Glenn Greenwald doing a sort of like a YouTube video about this. Basically what he seemed to be saying, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea, was that maybe in certain very specific instances where the values or the objectives actually align with certain groups, there could be a commonality of, you know, there could be an agreement on this particular issue that we would do something together. How that translates into sort of like, you know, the vegan movement. Well, I don't think there is a vegan movement, but I think it's, you know, if it was like alliances could be built and, you know, on a very specific sort of like, say, maybe close down a particular slaughterhouse or whatever it was, you know, that's an interesting possibility. But also there'd be sort of like a ring fence bound around sort of like people and groups that one didn't want to sort of like work with. So I think, you know, I was completely like, we should all be aligned, but really we should all be aligned on sort of like the pro-intersectional sort of like front. And now I'm sort of trying to sort of like figure it out in a different way. So I don't know, really.
Well, I mean, just to say about that, there's a couple of issues that people talk about there. I mean, you could talk about alliance politics, and so you tend to make alliances with people who share your politics in general terms. Although the actual idea of alliance politics is to challenge each other. There's a lot of talk about, well, you know, animal rights people are supposed to be supportive of human rights, but we're not allowed to call the human rights groups out on speciesism. Well, that's not the way it works, because we call everybody out on speciesism, including the people you work with. Then there's a more anarchic idea of we are each other, which is the idea that if you work with people, then the kind of divisions between, in terms of an alliance of different groups, then if it kind of works properly, the walls between the groups should dissolve until you're all together, you know. And so it was put, for example, that you know, as a vegan, I don't need to be, you know, convinced to be a feminist because I'm a vegan feminist, you know. So it kind of mashes together like a bit of a recipe, I suppose. Now you could say that's a bit unrealistic. I'm not quite sure, but it's that idea is very attractive. So alliance politics is almost like people stay in their box and they do kind of like, well, we can be in alliance with you for this, and we can be in alliance with you for that. The we are each other is that you kind of come into into alignment with each other. And one thing that the academics say about social movements is that not only do they involve identities, but they transform them. So social movements are supposed to be transformative in terms of the people who join them. And again, I'm not quite sure if that applies now generationally. Because I think that social movements used to radicalize people. But going back to what Ronnie was saying, really, I'm not quite sure whether it does anymore. Whether that's just because there's less people joining them who are radical, or the fact that it just doesn't do that function anymore, I'm not quite sure, but it is an interesting question.